those who visited. However, it wasn't long before the church realised that most of the money wasn't making its way to their coffers, but instead ending up in Lundgren's own pockets. By 1987, it was estimated he had stolen up to $40,000 in donations and revenue from the bookshop and visitor centre. Rather than alerting the authorities, the church quietly asked Lundgren to leave, which he did, making the family homeless. But Lundgren had slowly been strengthening his position as a spiritual leader all that time, and there was a group of people who would soon prove they would do anything for him. End of days. When Lundgren left the temple, he moved his family into a farmhouse, establishing his own church. Several other RLDS members chose to leave too, and soon Richard Brand, Daniel Kraft, Kevin Curry, Sharon Blunchley, Gregory Winship and Debbie Oliveris had moved in with the Lundgrens. Others also relocated to the small Ohio town, specifically to follow Lundgren. One such couple was Ron and Susan Love. In an interview at Cleveland newspaper in 1999, Susan said she believed they were joining an arts community and would be involved in local charity work. We were supposed to help the hungry. We were supposed to help the poor. Of course, none of that happened, she said. What did happen was that Susan was expected to do back-breaking chores and even dance naked while Lundgren watched. The group began referring to Lundgren as Dad, and all were expected to hand him the money they earned from their day jobs in order to exert ever more control over them. Lundgren began pretending he was receiving messages from a higher power and claimed he could read his followers' minds. In fact, he was simply eavesdropping on them. Evenings would be spent listening to Lundgren quote scriptures, but it was clear something wasn't quite right. The devout Lundgren had a gun and wore camouflage clothing. Another family who moved to the community to follow Lundgren were the Averys, Dennis and Cheryl, and their daughters Trina, 15, Rebecca, 13, and Karen, 7. However, they had trouble integrating. Rather than joining the farmhouse community, they chose to live in their own house, something Lundgren was said to have branded sinful. They also rejected Lundgren's assertion that women were inferior and should be obedient to men, and he developed a dislike of them, which would later seal their fate. Most of Lundgren's attention was still focused on the influential Kirkland Temple, but his messages were becoming ever more outlandish, relating to the end of days and only the faithful surviving. In 1988, the submersive and disruptive Lundgren was excommunicated from the RLDS, but according to court documents, Lundgren continued his classes, stressing the importance of Kirtland Temple. He said his followers had to recapture the temple so Christ would return. Coincidentally, this second coming was due to happen on Lundgren's own birthday. Lundgren spoke of his conversations with God and his visions. He discussed the Book of Revelations and the Book of Mormon and referred to pruning the vineyard. But what he was really talking about was murder. Lundgren began asserting that greater grip on his acolytes, and anyone who didn't agree with everything he said would be singled out for intimidation. In his mind, his main antagonists were the Avery family, who were the only ones not handing over their life savings, continuing to live apart from Lundgren and his remaining followers. He also resented the fact that the women in the family were strong-minded and independent, saying dismissively that Cheryl wore the pants. So when his mind went back to finding the promised land, he decided he needed to move followers off the grid. But not everyone was going to be welcome. Lundgren was about to decree that they needed to offer a blood sacrifice, and the ones chosen to die were the Avery family. Blood sacrifice. On 17th of April 1989, Lundgren put his terrible plan into motion, and the Averys were invited to visit him at the farmhouse. There, while the cult's women chatted to Cheryl and the 3 young Avery girls, Dennis was lured out to a nearby barn. There, he was confronted with a horrifying sight: a 7-foot hole dug into the ground. Lundgren's son, Damon, as well as cult members Brand, Love, Winship and Kraft, were all there when Dennis was bound and gagged with duct tape and taken to Lundgren. Unable to beg for his life or knowing what would happen to his wife or daughters, he was shot twice in the back by Lundgren. Horrifyingly, Cheryl was then lured out to the barn after being told Dennis needed her. She met the same dreadful fate, as Lundgren shot her 3 times in the chest and stomach, and the girls were not to escape. Court reports documented that Lundgren shot Trina once in the head and twice in the body, Rebecca in the back and thigh, and Karen in the head and chest. Love would later confess that he had carried 7-year-old Karen out to the barn on his shoulders. In an astonishing twist, the police turned up at the farmhouse the day after the murders. They were responding to local concerns that a cult was being run there, but tragically, Lundgren was able to convince them that nothing was wrong, and they had no idea of the events that had just transpired. The close shave was enough to make the group flee, and they made their way to West Virginia. They stayed together for months, but Lundgren's days were numbered when he decided to make follower Katherine Johnson his second wife. The move angered her estranged husband Larry Johnson, who tipped off law enforcement about the murders. In January 1990, police searched the farmhouse and found the bodies of the Avery family. Lundgren and the cult members were arrested over the following days, and many were charged with offences relating to the Avery's death. While most accepted plea deals in return for lenient sentences, the arrogant Lundgren insisted on his day in court. On the 29th of August, Lundgren was found guilty of aggravated murder and kidnapping. Speaking against the verdict, Lundgren declared, "I am not a false prophet, and therefore am not worthy of the penalty sought by those who seek my death. I cannot say that I am sorry. What God commanded me to do in the physical act, Lundgren is taken into custody by ATF officers. McAfee, man on the run. The bizarre story of how the cybersecurity expert became a wanted man. Back in the 1990s, tech pioneer John McAfee was deemed a hero for protecting our computers with his game-changing McAfee antivirus software. But in the noughties, after a drastic change of fortunes, McAfee would go from multi-millionaire entrepreneur to hunted fugitive after he was suspected of murdering a neighbour. And as the Netflix show Running with the Devil, The Wild World of John McAfee reveals, the story of how Silicon Valley's golden boy became a wanted man in an incredible tale of murder and mayhem. As McAfee says, "My decisions were the same decisions any average human would make. We all make mistakes. Tell me this is not a story worth telling." Rich and powerful, a highly respected programmer and coding genius who once worked for NASA on their Apollo Penitentiary Centre near Barcelona while awaiting extradition back to America. Accused of earning millions from 2014 to 2018, failing to file income tax returns and insider trading, he faced up to 30 years in prison. I have personally paid tens of millions of dollars in US taxes, he insisted. He had revealed his fear of spending the rest of his life behind bars. They will put me in jail and say I am a flight risk. I specialise in flighting, he said. But there was to be a shocking end to all the mayhem. McAfee, then 75, was found dead in his prison cell on the 23rd of June 2021. An apparent suicide by hanging hours after the Spanish National Court authorised his extradition to the States. Speculation surrounded his death, with conspiracy theorists declaring he was murdered on behalf of the US government. Before his death, the outspoken businessman claimed to have information on those in power and threatened to expose the truth. An official autopsy confirmed his death was suicide, which a Spanish court ruled in February 2022. More than a year after his death, his body remains in a Spanish morgue, while a legal case filed by his widow demanding further checks is yet to be resolved. Questions remain over his death because he had said several times that if he were ever found dead by hanging, it would mean that he was murdered. He got a tattoo in 2019 with a slogan implying he was not suicidal. If I suicide myself, I didn't. I was whacked, he said. He also told author Alex, I am not suicidal. If I go down, it will be fighting with my shoes on. His wife Janice also said she didn't believe that he was suicidal, claiming that the note that had been left was a forgery. His last words to me were, I love you and I will call you in the evening. Those words are not the words of somebody who is suicidal, she said. However, McAfee's ex-girlfriend, Samantha, dropped the shocking bombshell that he had faked his death to avoid the tax evasion charges and was secretly living in the US. 2 weeks after his death, I got a call from Texas. It's me, John. I paid off people to pretend that I'm dead, but I'm not dead. There are only 3 persons in this world that know I'm still alive. And then he asked me to run away with him, she said in the docu. Janice voiced her disbelief at Sam's allegations. She tweeted, "Oh, how I wish this were true. If John were alive, I'm pretty sure he would not be hiding out in Texas. We're talking about John McAfee, so anything is possible, but the likelihood of whose murder remains unsolved. His family and friends continue their search for answers and justice. His third wife, Janice, talking to local law enforcement, leaving court with girlfriend Sam. The Snapshot Killer. When Detective Chris Loudon reopened a cold case murder, the trail took him to a serial killer hiding in plain sight. In January 1976, 16-year-old Pamela Mora was hanging out with friends in Woolridge, Illinois. At around 10 p.m, she went to get a can of soda and never came back. The next morning, her partially frozen body was found on the side of the road. She had been strangled, but although there were signs of sexual assault, the coroner ruled it as not crimes that if you catch a guy for every crime you're aware of, there will be 6 that you're not. So if we knew Bruce did 12 rapes, imagine how many he probably did that didn't get reported. So if we know Bruce did 12 rapes, imagine how many he probably did that didn't get reported. You also identified 9 murder victims, but do you think there could be more? Twice that many. There are other names that we had on our board. We put up potential victims. We had the ones that we were certain of, the ones we were pretty certain of, and the ones we think could be him, but we'd never be able to prove it. And there's a lot of other girls. It wouldn't take much to do research on the internet of how many girls were killed from, let's say, 1971 to 1981 when Bruce died. And there's a lot of them that had similarities, but they're not inside the closed geographical range that we've been using to identify these 9 victims. If we expanded our geographical area to areas we knew he had been, for example, his girlfriend's family had a cottage up in Wisconsin. He went there all the time, sometimes without her. I don't believe he was going up there to go boating on his own. He was going there hunting, finding more targets. So who knows how many? Maybe it would be better for my sleep if I didn't know how many might be out there. What kind of man was Lindahl? Even women who he attacked said he could be extremely charming, and more than one woman told me he had the most beautiful eyes. He was disarming because he came across as very caring and empathetic. But the women told me it could be like flipping a switch with him. He went from being a nice guy to a sociopath, a psychopath. I don't know if I've ever loathed a person that I've never met as much as Lindahl. Because if you look at his victims, they were all these small, frail girls. He preyed on the weak, the timid, the fearful, the young. And the fact that he was taking pictures of young girls, that he drugged them and posed them. One woman I talked to told me he drugged her and then asked her what she liked sexually. That's how depraved he was. The box of sexually explicit pictures helped you identify victims. What we have, photo-wise, is just a small fraction of what there was. When Lindahl died, there were probably 2 carousels full of slides of young women in various stages of undress. I would say there were a few dozen different girls in there. One of the things we did was printed up the pictures and tried to compare the girls' pictures of girls we knew were dead. We have 3 we now believe are dead, and one's missing, Debbie McCall. After we did the press conference, her friend called and said she was the last person who saw Debbie. She looked at the picture of Lindahl and said, "That's definitely the guy she was with." And we have a picture of Debbie, naked, that we recovered from Lindahl when she looked like she was maybe 15 years old. Why do you think it went unnoticed? Up until the time we reopened the case, he was suspected of raping a few girls, and one of the girls disappeared frenzy, he stabbed him 24 times. Lindahl stabbed himself in the femoral artery at the same time and bled to death. When we look at the crime scene pictures, you've got Charles laying there dead, and Lindahl is laying kind of on top of him. Both dead, blood all over the place. You exhumed his body. How did it feel when his DNA matched the sample taken from Pamela? We were all screaming and hugging each other and a little bit of crying. Because by then we were pretty sure we had him anyway. But the confirmation, where you can just say, yeah, we got him, is just a relief. I flew out to Dallas to talk to Pam's family, to tell them in person, because it was so important for us to let them know this is what happened, this is the guy who did it. I asked them, do you want to know what happened to him? How much detail do you want? I let them choose. Given the fact that you believe there are more victims, can you let it go? I've recently retired, so if somebody ever wanted to open a cold case on this, I would do it for free. I would dedicate as much time as they needed. But after doing this and talking to the families of the girls that were murdered, I realised the universal theme is that cops never cared. And in addition to losing a family member to murder, the idea that no one cares about their loved one is even worse. To me, even if one cop sees this documentary and says, I want to start working those cases, and solves a case, gives one family closure, or gets justice for one victim, then that was worthwhile. So yeah, I will never let this go. The various guises of Bruce Lindahl. Charles Huber. Solved by a juniper tree needle. A husband's callous plot was uncovered. After murdering his wife in their Missouri apartment in late 2019, Joseph Elledge told police and her family that the mother of one had simply disappeared. But his calculating web of lies was finally exposed. jury opted to consider a charge of second-degree murder, effectively accepting there was no premeditation in his crime. Elledge was found guilty and given 28 years behind bars, the longest sentence available to the judge. Child abuse. Her husband received 1 year for every year of her life. Menke's family said after the verdict, "This doesn't bring her back. It doesn't make the nightmare of waking up every day and not being able to talk to or see your child go away. But it's justice in terms of what the American court system can provide." There was, however, more pain for the family. Just 4 months after his trial, Elledge was back in the dock, charged with abuse or neglect of a child, first-degree endangering the welfare of a child, and third-degree domestic assault in relation to his infant daughter. During a police search of his apartment, officers had found devices with photographs and videos of severe bruising to the young girl's backside, which they claimed were the result of Elledge hitting her. He knowingly caused a child to suffer physical injury as a result of grabbing or striking, the 2022 indictment against him read. Elledge initially pleaded not guilty, but changed his plea and was given an additional 10-year sentence to run concurrently with his almost 3-decade term for killing his wife. The couple with their baby. The search. The burial site. The trial. Menke's family with the press. That is that. These are the 3 that I have. Thanks for watching, I really appreciate the support. Please, if you have a preference for which one you want me to read next, just let me know.